going to let Rachel do the introduction, but I'm going to introduce one of our executive board members for Help for HD, Rachel, who is going to be doing this interview today for you guys. So we're going to let you take it over, Rachel.
All right. Thank you, ladies. I'm excited to do this. I'm going to start with the first question. Tell me what your name is.
My name is Erin Paterson, and I'm from Toronto, Canada.
Hello, nice to meet you. We've chatted a little bit through email, but it's, I guess, our first formal time meeting. So normally I would want to introduce you, but I let you introduce yourself. So next, on to the next question. Number 2, did you inherit HD from your mom or from your dad?
I inherited HD from my dad, and he has late onset Huntington's disease. So he is 78 years old now, and he's just really starting to have issues with mobility and feeding himself at this point in his life. So he's been doing pretty well up until now.
Okay. That's good to know. Good to hear.
Yeah.
Question number 3. When you got married, did your husband know about Huntington's disease or what Huntington's was?
So neither of us knew anything about Huntington's disease. We got married when we were 26, and it wasn't until we had settled down in our careers and we had decided, hey, you know what, we're going to have our family now. So we had gone over to my parents' house for brunch one morning, and we excitedly told them the news. Guess what, Mom and Dad, you'll probably be grandparents next year because we've decided to start our family. And unfortunately, our news was not with the excitement that we had anticipated, and we left that brunch feeling rather confused. And it wasn't until a couple of days later that we found out the long-held family secret that my grandmother might have had Huntington's disease when she passed away, but the gene wasn't discovered at the time of her passing, so there was no way to know for sure.
Okay. That was a lot to take in, I'm sure.
Yes.
Just to put it mildly,
sure.
yes.
Yeah.
So then I assume you got tested. How old were you when you decided to see if you had the HD gene?
So we had made that announcement to my parents. I was 31 years old at the time. And since my biological clock was ticking, I made the decision very quickly to get tested and went through genetic testing. I think I had to wait about 4 months to initially get into the Huntington's clinic in my city. And then after that, I had to wait another 8 weeks for our test results. So I found out about Huntington's disease and I went through genetic testing and I found out my results within a short 8 months, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is not a lot of time to really understand the impact that Huntington's disease would have on my family and on my life and on my future family.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, were there any deciding decisions you were trying to make that led you to test for the Huntington's gene?
It was presented to me at the time of me trying to conceive, and my parents' opinion held a lot of weight at that age for me. And I thought, oh, since they're telling me about it now, I guess that means that I have to find out about it now before I have kids. So my dad had said he was going to go through testing, but I didn't want to rush him in the process because I understood what a big decision that would be. So I actually got tested without anybody in my entire family knowing, which was another thing in hindsight that wasn't really great to do. So definitely it was because my biological clock was ticking, but also I'm the type of person who is a planner. I like to feel in control of my life. And for me, I felt like getting tested was the responsible thing to do. And that's why I went ahead with getting tested.
Of course, a lot to decide in a short amount of time.
Yes.
Now, you said a lot of this was, you said your biological clock was ticking. Did you and your husband try to conceive naturally then?
So when I found out I was gene positive for HD, I really fell into a big depression, and I found it hard to even be at home alone by myself. I was constantly keeping myself busy because whenever I was anywhere alone, I would just start thinking, oh my God, I'm going to get HD. I'm going to get HD. But in the middle of all that, I remember thinking to myself that I didn't want this to ruin my life. I wanted to find some way to be happy. And I started asking myself, what do I really want out of my life? And what do I think is going to be the thing that's going to make me happy? And for me, that was just settling down and having the family that I'd always dreamed of having. I just always knew I wanted to be a mom. I loved being around children. My mom ran a daycare out of her house when I was a kid. So that's just always the future I had imagined for myself. So what I said to myself at the time, and I said this as much to convince myself as anyone else, but I said to myself that my life has value as a person with HD, and so would the life of my child if they happen to inherit HD from me. So we went ahead and tried to conceive naturally. It wasn't a very confident decision because as there's a lot of turmoil going on at the time for me then, I was really riddled with a lot of guilt and doubt. And I didn't know if we were making the right decision. And I was new to the Huntington's community. So there was absolutely nowhere for us to turn to for support. We barely knew what Huntington's disease was. We didn't know anybody with it in their family. So there was really nobody to ask, what should we do? And so we just moved ahead and tried to conceive naturally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then did you ever consider IVF with the genetic testing?
Yeah, so after 1 year of trying to conceive naturally, we still weren't pregnant. So we ended up seeking out the help of a fertility doctor. And again, we went through treatments that were as minimally invasive as possible at first and we tried not to worry about passing on the gene, even though it was always in the back of my head. But unfortunately, none of the treatments that we tried worked. And the fertility doctor said to us that our next viable option was IVF. And I knew that if we were going to go as far as doing an IVF, that I couldn't justify it personally doing it without PGD. So we made the decision to go and do IVF with PGD. And at the time, this was back in 2008, so it's still considered pretty experimental at the time. And there wasn't even anywhere in Canada that we could do the process of PGD with. So we actually had to use a clinic out of Detroit.
Okay. Can you tell us about your experience going through the IVF with the PGD?
So going through IVF can be a pretty intense experience. Now, you would have to keep in mind that at that point, by the time I got to IVF with PGD, I'd been trying to have a family for already 2.5 years. So I was pretty frustrated by the time I got there, and I was already emotionally dragged down. So the process was a little bit challenging for me. It's uncomfortable on your body, but it's not painful in any way. So going through it is okay. There is a lot of needles to deal with, but even that you can suck it up and deal with it because that the end result might be a baby. On our first round of IVF with PGD, we didn't get very many embryos. I was a very poor responder to the drugs. And it was as we were driving down to the clinic to have the transfer of the embryos into my womb that my doctor actually called my cell phone. And we found out on that car ride that all of our embryos had tested positive for Huntington's disease. So unfortunately, we didn't get to do a transfer during that round. And that was a really devastating thing to go through. We knew that it could happen, but we never expected it to happen. Who could think that we were going to have such bad luck? And we took a couple of months off, and we decided that we were going to try again because we felt like we really didn't get a chance that first time. And on our second round of IVF with PGD, we had 2 embryos that were HD free, and we implanted both of them into my womb at the same time. But unfortunately, neither of them resulted in a pregnancy. And at that point in time, I was just emotionally exhausted, physically exhausted, and we were financially drained. And I knew that I couldn't set foot in another fertility clinic ever again. So we made the very difficult and painful decision to stop fertility treatments. And we took a lot of time to consider how we were going to move forward with our life, because I still had the dream of becoming a parent. I just didn't know at that point how we were going to get there.
You touched on a little bit the financial side of it, that you were financially drained. Now, going through this process of IVF with PGD, did you do self-pay or did you utilize any programs to help you with the process?
So in Canada, a small portion of the fee is covered by government health insurance, but a very, very small amount. So we actually had to pay for the rest of the process out of pocket. So at that time, that was about $15,000 to $20,000 per round.
Okay. And then you touched on this also. How many times did you go through the IVF with PGD?
We went through it a total of 2 times.
2 times. Okay.
Yeah.
What would you say the biggest struggle or challenge that you faced going through all of this? And we can assume, you touched on that a little bit also, was it emotionally, financially, physically, mentally? All of the
There was a lot.
above.
I think I was thinking about this question before because you were saying specifically in the IVF with PGD process. And for me, it was a real challenge to manage my stress levels. I was so intent on getting pregnant and I felt so much pressure on me and my body to get this right. All of my dreams for our future was riding on my body's ability to be able to get pregnant. And that was a tremendous amount of pressure. So I actually stopped doing anything that I thought might hinder my chances of getting pregnant, no matter how ridiculous I thought it might be. Like, you don't eat soft cheeses, and I stopped running, which was my form of stress relief. I didn't drink coffee. I didn't even have hot showers. Funnily enough. And so that put even more pressure on myself. And I really didn't have any coping mechanisms to replace being physically active and running with. Recently, I've started meditating and I found that to be really helpful with my daily life now. So I wished that I had had something like that at the time.
Of course, yeah. Tell us a little bit, or continue to tell us about the emotions you felt when realizing that the IVF with PGD did not take.
I was at home alone that day when we went through our second round of IVF with PGD, and I was really distracted. I was just trying to keep myself busy because I knew my test results probably wouldn't come in until about 2 p.m. And when the phone finally rang, I was terrified of answering it, but of course I did. And on the other end of the line was the clinic nurse saying the same thing she had said for the past 2.5 years, which was, "I'm so sorry, your pregnancy test came back negative. It didn't work." And I just flopped down onto my bed and sobbed for a very long time. And my husband was waiting for me to call, so I did manage to dial his number and just cried on the phone. And I didn't even say anything, and he just knew what had happened. And I just felt in that moment like all of my dreams are crushed. Like, how is it going to be possible if this didn't work to ever become a parent? But again, like after I got diagnosed, I said to myself, I don't want this to ruin my life. I have to find a way to move on from this. That was my mantra whenever we are going through things with Huntington's disease and infertility. Like, this isn't going to ruin my life. I'm going to find a way to move on from this.
I'm getting emotional hearing your story, Erin. I've been through 3 rounds of IVF myself with my family, and I am blessed with 2 babies. We did have one that didn't take, and I remember that feeling.
Yeah.
But you've been going through this for 2.5 years when you finally faced that and then decided. So you are so strong. You were so
Thank
strong.
you.
But let's move on to happiness. What was the conversation like between you and your husband when you decided to have a child in another way?
So through this whole thing, our conversations were always very tense. I was the one putting my body through all of the treatments, so I tended to want to move on to the next thing very quickly. Oh, this didn't work. I tried it twice. Let's try the next thing. Whereas he's like, let's just try that thing one more time. And I'm like, no, it made me feel awful. I don't want to do that again. So we weren't always on the same page. And I felt that I was very affected by the medications. So I was an emotional basket case, and I was very unreasonable a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So my husband was very supportive and kind and loving. And there were just times that we just had to be apart from each other so that we wouldn't get on each other's nerves or end up having a big fight, for sure.
Of course. Then what was the deciding factor to help you decide then on adoption?
We looked at a lot of other things like surrogacy and donor egg and donor embryo. And when I pictured myself in the future having a child and explaining to the child how they came into this world, I thought it would be very hard to explain the concept of donor embryo or donor egg to them. And with adoption, there's already a child who's born in need of parents. So for me, that just made a lot more sense. And at the same time, we couldn't afford to do everything, right? We were getting older. We only had so much money. So we were trying to pick the thing that we thought would be the thing that would most likely work out. And with those other things, of course, I didn't have any confidence in my body to accept a donor egg or a donor embryo. So that was a part of the decision as well.
Okay. What was your biggest fear then about adoption?
Oh, my biggest fear was that we would get turned down because of my genetic status. So when we were going to adopt, I knew that my genetic status might be an issue, and I started researching it. I hired some consultants and asked them for advice, and nobody could tell us whether or not my HD genetic status would be an issue. I was told that I would have trouble if I was going to be adopting overseas, and that adopting domestically would be the best option for us. So the process in Canada and the United States is somewhat similar. We had to go through PRI training, which is parenting classes, 27 hours of adoption specific parenting classes. And we had a home study done, which is 10 hours of interviews with a social worker. And we had to submit our finances, we had to get our fingerprints taken, and we had to submit a medical.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then how did you start the process of finding a child to adopt? Did you go through an agency, a social worker?
In Canada, you can adopt privately or you can adopt through a social agency like Children's Aid Society. We decided not to go through the Children's Aid Society just because our interactions with them weren't very positive, and we decided to adopt privately instead, which means that the birth parents have to choose you to be the parents of their child. So how that happens is we created what's called a life book. So it's a book about our lives with pictures and stories about us. We actually wrote out a letter to the birth parents just describing what our life was like. And then we put all of those together in some handmade books that we made. And then we registered with a bunch of lawyers all over our province. So I think we registered with 15 lawyers and sent in our life books and our home study information. And what would happen is if birth parents went into the lawyer's office and said they wanted to make an adoption plan for their baby, they would be shown some of these life books and they can choose who they want to be the parents of their child from those life books.
Okay. And then was HD ever brought into the conversation with the birth
100%.
family then? Okay.
Well, not with the birth family. It came up for sure in the home study interviews.
Okay.
Because they're asking you about every single aspect of your life. So we knew that Huntington's disease was going to come up at some point because I'd just been diagnosed. My parents had just gotten separated. Like our life was in huge turmoil. And it was really hard for me to even speak about Huntington's disease or even think about Huntington's disease without crying. And it was still something that I kept a secret because I was afraid if people found out about my genetic status, they wouldn't want to be friends with me. So to have to go into the home study interviews and speak about Huntington's disease without even crying was a huge feat. But I knew that we were being judged on our ability to be great parents, and they want to make sure you're going to be around and able to care for a child if you're going to adopt them. If you're not cancer-free for a certain number of years, you can't adopt a child. So for sure, I was worried about Huntington's disease being an issue. So a friend of ours gave us really great advice, was just speak about Huntington's disease in a positive light. And you're the one who's going to be educating the practitioner or the social worker on what Huntington's disease is. And if you make a huge big deal about it, they're going to think it's something to be worried about. So we just would think about what questions do we think we're going to get asked during the home study interview, and then we'd actually rehearse them before we went into those meetings.
Of course, super great advice to make it in a positive light, because we can. It's a hard disease, but we can. The community, especially, being a huge one. So jumping to the really good news, you were able to adopt.
Yes.
And you have a daughter.
Yes.
Do you talk to her about Huntington's, and how do you talk to her about Huntington's disease?
So it's the same advice as within the home study. We always speak about it in a positive way, but we try to provide balance. And I am very aware that the way that I am speaking about her grandfather who has Huntington's disease and the way that I am helping him with things, she's watching that and will see that. And I know that's educating her on how I want to be treated in the future when I'm sick as well. So I'm very careful about my interactions with my dad and the things that I say to her. And I might say, oh my gosh, I had a really hard visit with grandpa. He was having a lot of trouble walking today. And that was really hard for me to see. But then I say, but isn't it great? He's like 78 years old and he's still walking with a walker. That's pretty freaking amazing.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. And then the other day she skipped school because she was just not feeling happy. So we went out for brunch together and we had a discussion. I don't know how Huntington's disease came up. And I started talking to her about a camp for youth that are affected by Huntington's disease. And she loves camp and is a huge fan of overnight camp. So I knew she would like to go to that one day. And I was just talking to her about how she would meet other people there from Huntington's families and what a great, I was just trying to set up the idea of support networks and getting involved in the community because I know that will be helpful for her in the future.
Absolutely. Now, if you were going to talk to a young woman thinking about having children that is curious about either IVF with PGD or adoption,
yeah,
what would you say?
So I put so much pressure on myself to make the right decision. And I was just really concerned with doing what was correct. And what I've since learned is that there is no wrong way to have your family, and that whatever you decide to do is okay. And that the only people that have to be okay with your decision are you and your partner. And even within families, people are going to disagree, and that's okay. Everybody has to make the choices for the unique set of circumstances.
I love that. Yes. Thank you, Erin. Now, you recently wrote a book and it was released. Tell the listeners about the book and where can we purchase it?
Yep, I wrote this book. It's called All Good Things, a memoir about genetic testing, infertility, and one woman's relentless search for happiness. I spent 4 years of crying over the computer keyboard and writing it. And I wrote it because in my family, Huntington's disease was such a secretive thing. And living with a secret can make you feel shameful. And there weren't any positive Huntington stories out there at the time. So I wrote it because I wanted to put a voice to the experiences that we as a community go through. And I knew that writing it and putting those feelings and thoughts to words would help other people that are coming up behind me who are going through the same thing. I think it's really important, and that storytelling can be very healing.